You're known for being a real expert on Fenaroli, and so did you begin to tackle his Partimenti exercises and look at his materials?
What I find so stimulating with the Partimenti of Fenaroli, indeed, he's one of my friends. I can say even in the meantime, what I find so amazing. I mean, there are two things for me which are so amazing. At the one hand, his method is arguably the best, in a sense that I've been studying so many manuscripts of his Partimenti, and they show actually very similar contents. There is a small evolution within the Partimento corpus of Fenaroli. At the beginning of his career, there were lesser Partimento in his full corpus than later on. And at the very end of his life, he decided to write even a full-blown new book with complex Partimenti. But aside from that, what you see is a constant concern for gradual increase of complexity. So the method is so beautiful. He starts easily in his first book with the main rules, so to speak. I won't get technical now.
Oh, you can, please.
That's fantastic. So he just starts with cadences. Now that's a fairly easy thing to conceive. And then in the same book, he obviously wants also the rule of the octave to be known. The rule of the octave, which was a tool for the student to know which chord to play on every note of the scale. I mean, in the left hand, when the bass moves stepwise. So when you have do re di do di da, on each note, the student had to learn which chord to play. This is basically the material for the first book. He must have introduced already modulation, because right from the start, from his very first Partimento, you see that he wants his students already to get acquainted with a real musical situation. It starts in G major. After a couple of bars, he goes to D major, and then he comes back to G major. And exactly that is for me one of the things which touches me so much, because he's, as perhaps every Partimento teacher, he is so concerned with an actual musical situation. He does not want to instruct students into music theory. He wants to instruct pupils into music practice. And you see right from the start that his Partimenti are very small but real musical compositions. And gradually the Partimenti get bigger and bigger. And there I have to make the link to the research and the work of Mr. Gerdingen. You see that the schemas that are discussed within Mr. Gerdingen's famous book on the gallant style all appear within the Partimenti of Fenaroli, and exactly at the places where they should occur. Because this is absolutely astonishing, an astonishing observation. What Robert Gerdingen has achieved. One of the things which is so fascinating about his work is that not only he identified so many schemas, but what is even more important for me is that a certain schema has a certain place by preference in a certain composition. And this means that when you look at the Partimenti of Fenaroli, those specific, in Italian we call them moti del basso, will occur at specific places within the Partimento. This does not mean that they cannot occur in other places, obviously, but the student had to learn his craft. And so, for instance, when a piece is in G major, you get the logical modulation to D major, towards the middle of the piece, after which Fenaroli very, very often, but really very often, introduces a fonte, because that was the place to put a fonte. And so you really see the concern of Fenaroli right from the start to train his students to become a professional musician, to learn music, not to learn about music. And this is for me, this is so amazing and so important that when I teach myself, that I can make the connection with living music, that when I have a piano student who, let's be honest about it, the piano student often has focus on the pianism, has a focus on playing his 6, 7, 8 hours a day. And if I can show them that when they play a Mozart sonata, that they should play the repeats, that the repeat is not there to annoy them or to be left out. What they do mostly, they leave out the repeat because they don't know often they are annoyed with it or they don't know what to do with it. But if you know the language from within, in the repeat you can change things. You could change even a complete moto del basso. You could change the decoratio. You could add some ornaments, etc., etc., etc.
You mentioned modulation in Fenaroli right from the earliest Partimenti, but I was curious, he doesn't really discuss mutation, right, in his rules. I think you can find that in Furno, but you can't find that in Fenaroli's rules. So are there some things that are missing, so to speak, within his rules?
But there are a lot of things missing in his rules. His rules are really, I would say, rudimentary, and he even, I can't remember, I think it's in his preface or right at the end of his regulae that he says that if one finds mistakes or if one feels the necessity of adding rules, please do. So you see, it's really a starting point. It's really rudimentary, and it also shows the huge importance of the one-to-one contact. It shows the relation, so to speak, of mentor and disciple. That they had this, in Neapolitan education, there was this oral tradition. You had the teacher, you had the student, and they had a lot of lesson, very intense relationship. And of course, when you have on a fairly daily basis lesson, there is no need to notate so much. Hence the difficulty for us to understand this training, what this training really consisted of. Hence also the fact that it took so long, that is one of the reasons, that it took so long to discover this training. I mean, if I look at, I've studied the counterpoint courses of several of Fenaroli students. So there is a beautiful manuscript, there are more of them, by a certain Biagio Muscogiuri, who followed counterpoint in the 80s, amongst others, with Fenaroli, but also with an assistant of Fenaroli. And there I've made a study of trying to find the rules just from analyzing, from playing all the counterpoint exercises. And one of the things which struck me was the amount of things Fenaroli had to add during the courses to be able at arriving at such an incredibly high level of counterpoint, of the quality of the counterpoint, the quality of composition, if one can say, is astonishingly high. There is a second counterpoint course which I studied, which is a little more known than Muscogiuri. This is the counterpoint course by Lavinia, which is the beginning of the 90s, first half of the 90s.
You're talking about 1790s, right? Not the 1990s.
1790s, yes. Yeah,
not talking about the Backstreet Boys here, right?
Yeah. not quite, I would say. And there you see the amount of exercises they had to write is absolutely astonishing. Hundreds and hundreds of pages of high quality of composition counterpoint / composition. And this explains why those students, why those composers had such a craft. And this is one of the things I try to explain students now that if they want to achieve a high level in whatever area, they have to invest in themselves.
Can you comment on books 2, 4, and 5? What somebody could expect and your insights into these other books that Fenaroli has?
Book 2 is let's say is of another level. In book 1, everything is fairly short and is an illustration of, I would say, the basic rules. When he goes to the second book, what he does there is a full-blown training of dissonances. So already when you look at the first one, when I give the first one to a student, he or she panics because of the sheer amount of figures, but also by its size and by the different tonalities, even G minor within G major, etc. So there you see that Fenaroli takes it to, brusquely, I would say, to really another level. And it goes on. Every Partimento is really challenging and a real illustration, a real application of dissonances, both so dissonances in the bass, and dissonances implied or explicit within the realization of the right hand. And as always, Fenaroli anticipates what will come later. So this means that in the second book, you will see already moti del basso appear. I think, for instance, of the B minor one, which is a beautiful chromatically descending bass in the beginning, where he anticipates what will be seen later as a full-blown moto del basso. And again, in the second book, he still respects the same order of keys like he did in the first book. So he starts on G and he works his way up to the keys, so G, A, B, D, etc. And then that's the second book, really a very hard training on the dissonances. And then when we go to the next book, you speak of fourth book, I speak of third book, because this would lead me a little bit too far now, but I don't believe, I've written an article on that recently in 18th century music, I don't believe that the organization of the first edition of the complete corpus by Fenaroli, the complete Partimento corpus by Fenaroli, is what reflects Fenaroli as a teacher.
You mentioned actually that, was it in Bimbo? They kind of messed it up, or they kind of put it in the wrong order.
Yeah, so it would be too complex now to get into that, but indeed he mixed up, I believe, some series of Partimenti. As I've tried to explain, Fenaroli really explains things, cadences, rule of the octave, and then as an application, he gives a series of Partimenti. Then he explains dissonances. To applicate that, he gives a series of Partimenti. And then afterwards, he explains the moti del basso, on which he gives a long series of Partimenti. And in Bimbo, he changes and he gives very simple Partimenti after more complex Partimenti. So you see that the logical increase of difficulty is not there anymore. So he gets, like you say, mixed up. And actually what in Bimbo calls book 3 is only the it's a big book, but still is the explanation of the moti del basso. But it does not contain the actual partimenti on the moto del basso. For him, this is book 4. Not only, but basically it's book 4. So this does not make sense. So what you say is book 4 is for me book 3. And actually all the manuscripts that I saw, nearly all the manuscripts that I saw, confirm that. And one could say that book 1, book 2, and book 3 of Fenaroli consisted his basic Partimento course. And then what in Bimbo calls Book 5, which are the more complex preludes, fugues, so the more contrapuntal pieces. This is actually the more advanced Partimento course, one could say. And actually, for in Bimbo's, Fenaroli was to a certain extent implicated, apparently, within the edition, but complained because he wrote to a student of him, Marco Santucci, that in Bimbo was preparing his edition, but it was full with errors. And so obviously a little bit pitiful. But for that edition, especially for that edition, Fenaroli wrote to Santucci that he composed a 5th book of Partimenti. Not the 6th book as they are published in Bimbo, but the 5th book of the most complex fugal Partimento you will ever find. So this is somewhat the bigger picture of Fenaroli Partimenti, and one should not forget that the most complex Partimenti by Fenaroli, so the last book, what Fenaroli himself called the 5th book, were actually composed only at the very, very, very end of his life, from 1811 probably, and he died in 1818. So that book had hardly any, if at all, importance, I would say, within the musical training of Fenaroli.